During the 19th century in Australia, the state of Victoria experienced a growth in the number of mentally ill people. To accommodate the growth in this group of people, it was decided that a mental hospital would be built at Ararat, located 120 miles west of Melbourne. The hospital was originally named after the town, but its name changed with time. The 21st of October 2017 marked the 150th anniversary of the Aradale Mental Hospital. Aradale wasn't the only mental hospital built at that time. When Aradale was commissioned, 2 sister asylums were also scheduled to be built at Kew and Beechworth. Aradale was the first hospital to be completed, with construction starting in 1864. Aradale's list of patients dates back to 1865. Aradale was designed by G.W. Vivian and J.J. Clark. Vivian's designs for the hospitals at Kew and Beechworth were adapted for Aradale. For some time, it was believed that the patients built the hospital, but this wasn't the case. Aradale's design was based on the 1850s model used at Colney Hatch in England, and is an example of an E-plan barracks-type asylum with an Italianate design. The hospital was self-sufficient and had its own piggery, chapel and fire station, amongst other things. Men and women were separated, with 2 wings being built on the side of the building, 1 for each sex. The wings were surrounded by courtyards lined with iron-columned verandas. The patient's courtyard was completely surrounded by ha-ha walls. A ha-ha wall is made of a trench, with one side being vertical and covered with stone or bricks. The other side was sloped and covered in turf. To the patients, the walls were tall and prevented them from escaping. To those on the outside, the walls looked low, suggesting that the hospital wasn't a place of imprisonment. The landscape gardener Hugh Lineker designed the rest of the grounds, but not much of his work remains today. Until 1886, the local jail was kept at the hospital, but changes were made that year when the jail was declared the J Ward of the Ararat Asylum. From then on, the J Ward housed anyone who had been detained in a jail, reformatory, or industrial school who seemed to be mentally ill. When an asylum was built at Sunbury for those who had been ruled criminally insane, female patients were moved there. Men stayed at J Ward. While J Ward was still the local jail, 3 prisoners were hanged and then buried vertically in the exercise yard. Only 3 small scratches indicate where the graves are. Only 2 signatures were required to send someone to Aradale. Later this changed to 8 signatures, meaning it was even harder for someone to secure their release from the hospital. At the time, there were only 4 classifications for mental illness: mania, melancholia, dementia, and paranoia. Illnesses we understand today were made to fit these categories. But you could even be confined for things that today seem ridiculous. Records show that women had been sent to Aradale for reading too much, and Chinese people who couldn't speak English were confined there. Treatment at Aradale included restraint bags, strap chairs, electroconvulsive therapy, isolation cages, bleeding, and lobotomies. Patients were also given work to do under an 1800s movement that aimed to teach patients morals by giving them responsibilities. Men farmed and made shoes, and women washed and sewed. but a third of those admitted to Aradale were never released. 4 or 5 inmates died each week, and this was when a contagious illness wasn't present. Over the hospital's lifetime, 13,000 patients died. Bill Wallace was a suspected murderer who had never been tried or convicted for allegedly killing a friend after they argued over a cigarette. In 1925, Bill was sent to Aradale by 2 doctors. Bill never left Aradale and died there in 1989 at the age of 107. While working at Aradale, one doctor, possibly named Dr. O'Brien, began writing patients' stories about how they came to be at the hospital. The doctor made notes on the patient's progress and what their chances of recovery were. Patient Timothy Shannon, aged 35, gave the doctor the following account on the 20th of May, 1892. "My name is Tim Shannon. I was born in County Clare. I have friends out here, 2 in Melbourne. Pat Shannon lives in Dryden Street, South Melbourne, and the other is Tom Shannon, a caster in Carlton. I forget the name of the street. I suppose it is 3 or 4 years since I went there. You are Dr. O'Brien, at least I've heard them call you so. I got frightened of the people outside going to kill me. I took it in my mind like that. I've got these ideas in my mind now. I think they tried to injure me, but I did not see them. I would like to get out. But I think he could not support me if I did not work. I used to take 4 or 5 pints of beer. I don't sleep at night. I'm frightened at somebody coming to kill me. I am not strong enough to work." In 1988, it was announced that J Ward would be closed. At its height, Aradale had over 500 employees, and when the closure of the entire hospital was announced, there were 63 buildings on the site. Decommissioning began in the early 1990s, and by the end of 1993, the Ararat Forensic Psychiatry Centre was the only ward in use. The last patients were moved in 1997. In 2001, the Melbourne Polytechnic was given $7.4 million by the state of Victoria to create a campus on the property. The Polytechnic wanted to create a world-class wine and hospitality training centre. 30 hectares of vineyard, 10 hectares of olive grove, and 4 hectares of lavender were planted. A 250-ton winery and training facility was built. Today the public can tour the now derelict hospital, which is now home to the ghosts of the past. Screams are heard, doors slam, cold breezes are felt, and disembodied voices are heard. You might hear banging coming from the men's isolation cells, and you might be touched by icy cold hands in the men's surgery wing. Many have seen the spirit of an old woman known as Old Margaret. To her, Aradale was the only home she ever had, having been sent there at a young age. Margaret only left when the hospital closed for good. Margaret can now be seen wandering the old building, perhaps looking for a friend. People who have explored the superintendent's office have often started feeling unwell. They report feeling a foul taste in their mouths and being overcome by nausea. This is hardly surprising, considering a superintendent killed himself by drinking prussic acid, otherwise known as hydrogen cyanide, in that very office. A variety of hauntings have been experienced in J Ward. People have been pushed and bitten. Electronic equipment often malfunctions. Clocks can be heard ticking, despite the fact that the clocks once housed there have been removed. The voice of a man called Gary Webb, a prisoner who mutilated himself over 70 times, has been heard telling people to get out of his cell. In another cell, visitors have entered a trance-like state which doesn't end until the person affected leaves the building. J. Ward's underground kitchen is haunted by a young boy called Stuart, as well as a cook. But it's in the governor's bathroom that people feel an evil presence. Does this presence have anything to do with a prisoner who is said to have been murdered and dismembered in the bath? Finally, visitors who tour the building have reported seeing a woman in the women's wing. She is said to be Nurse Carey, a nasty and cruel employee. Those who have seen her mention how she stares right at them, forcing them to leave. Aradale Mental Hospital is just one place that represents a small part of the history of mental illness. It is perhaps a place built with good intentions, but only served to imprison thousands. If you decide to tour Aradale, perhaps say a kind word to Nurse Carey. She doesn't sound like the kind of spirit you would want following you home. Happy nightmares.